Well, right now in this season of Epiphany, we are working our way through Mark, and Mark's telling of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. John the Baptist has exited stage left, and Jesus has been baptized. He has been tempted in the wilderness. He has announced the coming of the kingdom of God, and he has called a few disciples. And then this week's passage finds him in the synagogue, where he is teaching at the beginning of the week, and not just teaching, but teaching with authority. And when he's teaching with this authority, he's suddenly confronted by a man with an unclean spirit. Mark doesn't say that this is a man possessed by a demon, but pretty much after this, Mark starts talking about demons a lot. So I think it's safe to assume that that's what we're dealing with here. And when I first glanced at this text, I thought, wonderful. I'm going to get a chance to talk about healing, because in a way this is a healing story, right? And then I read it over and over and over, and I realized, well, actually this is pretty much an exorcism, which means I have to deal with demon possession and talk about that, which is, uncomfortable to modern ears. So if you're wondering, is this going to be one of those long Baptist stem winders that's warning about the dangers of demon possession? The short answer is no. The long answer is maybe a little bit. So let's dive in, because the fact of the matter is there are a lot of demon passages in the Bible, and we sort of got to figure out a way to deal with them, one way or the other. And one way, historically, has been what you could call the spiritual approach, and the other is the material approach. Call it ancient or modern. The ancient version really thinks of demons as like creatures, supernatural creatures, invisible maybe, horrific monsters floating through the air, waiting for us to slip up, and then they'll jump in and possess you and steer you towards evil. And then the modern version, well, we think of these demons as maybe supernatural language describing a natural event that the people didn't have words for. So we tend to go to a mental health diagnosis, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. And that's partly the reason why our modern ears see this and immediately jump to a healing and not an exorcism. And I think it's safe to say that most of us lean towards the modern in how we approach these things, at least our initial instinct, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, if you walked into an emergency room right now and you brought your friend and the doctor said, "Oh no, what's wrong with them?" You said, "We have a very severe case of demon possession." It probably would not go down so well for you. So the science doesn't really support us, but on a deeper level, I think a lot of us, especially in church communities or who've come out of church communities that still talk about this a lot, have noticed that there's something wrong with this demon possession model. It tends to be used as a weapon against people who disagree or dissent, used as a weapon against women or gay or trans folks, or as an excuse not to get medical care. It becomes very dangerous. It also is a very individualist ethos. We never reckon with communal problems. We just say, look at the demon, get rid of them. So it's a problem for all of us, and I think that liberals out there, fellow liberals I like to say, I think we tend to look at this as a conservative issue. But let's be honest, there's an extent to which we slip into this as well. Maybe we don't, assign a supernatural agency, but we do look at people sometimes and we say, they're stuck with this outdated, misinformed bigotry and prejudice, and if only they had an exorcism from fake news, that would get them to agree with me and realize how smart I am and how correct I am. It doesn't have the supernatural elements, but it's that same logic of behavior. And so it's a challenge to all of us. And the modern worldview, okay, that seems a lot better, but there are some downsides as well. For starters, I think we probably need to be really careful about linking mental health diagnoses with the demonic standing opposed to God. You go down that road and it has some uncomfortable conclusions. God does not dismiss or condemn people with mental health diagnoses, not at all. And at a deeper level, it sort of feels like the overemphasis on the material tosses the spiritual out along with the supernatural. So there's a spiritual dimension of life that is neglected in that analysis. Big picture, I think that we're stuck between these two models, and one of them forgets that we are embodied souls, and the other forgets that we're embodied souls, if you see my meaning. And so we have to ask ourselves, like, what do we go from here? What's the better answer? And it starts with remembering that there is a spiritual dimension to all of life, to the life of people, to the life of institutions. Sometimes we call it a culture, like a work culture, or an ethos, but it's deeper and more mysterious than that. It's a lived, experienced, deeply committed orientation towards how we relate to each other and how we relate to the mystery of love that we call God. Now, Bible scholar Walter Wink actually says that all of the language around demons and angels and powers and principalities is a way of describing that spirituality. So it's not a metaphor for something natural, nor is it describing something real but supernatural. Not a metaphor for the natural or real but supernatural. It is a symbol describing a real spirituality. So think of it this way. Spirituality that is good for human beings, that leads to wholeness, that leads to dignity and thriving, that's wonderful. But when it goes all wonky and sideways, it becomes bad. It becomes, in Wink's terminology, demonic. Wink says, an institution becomes demonic when it abandons its divine vocation, love, thriving, wholeness. Abandons its divine vocation for the pursuit of its own idolatrous goals, power, violence, domination. The demons are the psychic power or spiritual power emanated by organizations or individuals or sub-aspects of individuals whose energies are bent on overpowering others. Bent on overpowering others. Spirituality becomes demonic when it relies on demonizing others. It's kind of an irony of how that word has come to be so popular in our language, but demonizing others is itself demonic. Demonizing others is what is demonic. So, think about it this way. There's nothing really inherently bad about having pride in a collective. I'm really proud to belong to this church community. The people are proud of following a sports team or the country they are from or their ethnicity. But at a certain point, when that pride starts relying on hatred towards groups on the other side, when it becomes about insisting that yours is the best and only way and dominating and violence, it becomes evil, becomes violent and destructive, and in Wink's terms, demonic. You look at it as we need an economy, right? We need a way to figure out how, to get all the things that people need to thrive to all the people. But when that economy starts to require and tolerate and demand things like slavery or child labor or the exploitation or the exploit of workers or the exploitation of the environment, well, at that point, it's become a destructive system that takes God's beloved and turns them into things and grinds them up. And that is a demonic spirituality inside of that system. So thinking with this mind of not supernatural versus natural, but describing a spirituality, let's go back and look at this story in Mark, because we're going to notice different stuff. For starters, Mark opens this story by saying that Jesus teaches with authority, not like the scribes do. He tees up this whole story not as Jesus versus the man, but Jesus versus the scribes. Jesus versus the whole scribal system, the whole status quo. And then what about the man himself? He challenges Jesus. He says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us?" Who is the us? There's just one dude there. Is he talking about him and the demon? Is he talking about him and all the demons and all his demon buddies? Or is he talking about the demons of this entire broken status quo, the demons of Rome and a totalitarian system that is cruel and oppressive? Is that what he's saying Jesus is coming to attack? And notice that Jesus, I love this, Jesus doesn't toss the man out of the community. He tosses the demonic ideas out of the man so that he can come back into the community. The point is to get the demonic divisive spirituality out to restore wholeness and community. And wait a second, that sounds actually a lot like healing. A lot like healing that starts with recognizing these demonic spiritualities and moving on to something better. So maybe exorcism and healing go together in the Bible, because exorcism is healing the sickness that leads to sickness. The sickness that leads to, creates, allows sickness. Think about it. After the last person is healed of COVID-19, we're still going to have this world that allowed COVID to come about, that created it, that made it a pandemic that hurt so many people worse than others. Or think about it in our own lives. After we make a mistake, after we go through a bad breakup, after there's a breach of trust, yeah, there's ramifications for our actions, but there's also something we have to do to discover what spirituality it was that led us to that mindset, to that way of living in the world. In recovery communities, they call this like a dry drunk, somebody who's quit drinking but hasn't done any of the work, the spiritual work, to figure out what's actually going on. I've seen this in activist circles so many times. People who are trying to build something better, trying so hard, but they're doing it with the same bitterness and anger and goal of conquest as the system around them, and so they end up repeating the same stuff. This is why Wink says that any attempt to transform a social system without addressing both its spirituality and its outer forms is doomed to failure. Sounds like sometimes we get stuck on one or the other, right? So this exorcism, this healing that leads to healing, this is an example of God's dream breaking into the world. It is never only individual, though it affects individuals. It's not ever only spiritual, though it is more than physical. It is never only material, even though it helps heal us from illness. Jesus runs around confronting and outloving every demonic system. Jesus loves people out of their hatred and out of the twisted things they fall into. Jesus allows himself to be demonized by the crowd, the mob, by the Pharisees, by the Roman establishment. Allows himself to be demonized to the point of death, to show us how dependent we are on us demonizing others. He breaks their power because we all realize there's a better way. And so we don't have to go down that road. We can step into something different because Jesus is not dead. Jesus is alive and alongside us and walking us toward that better path, even though we screw up all the time and have to start over. So yesterday, I was watching the live stream of my cousin's son's bar mitzvah. The rabbi shared a wonderful bit of writing that gets at a little bit what I'm talking about by sickness that leads to sickness, healing that begins healing. It's a bit of text by Roy Scranton, who published in the New York Times. And I thought about this and I realized that Christians have basically been working with the best Jewish material for 2,000 years. So I was just going to take this Scranton piece straight that I heard from the rabbi. Scranton writes, as the pandemic has worn on, the desire to get back to normal has increased, and I worry that the hope for radical positive change has subsided. But we must not let it dissipate. We can't afford to, because we won't see normal again in our lifetimes. Our parents and grandparents burned normal up. in their American-built cars, with their American lifestyles, their American refrigerators and American dreams. And now China and India are doing it too because capitalism is global and we sold it wherever we could. More than 3/4 of all industrial CO2 emissions have occurred since 1945, and more than half have occurred since 1988, since, in fact, we knew what global warming was and what a danger it posed. The next 20 years will be a period of deep uncertainty and tremendous risk, no matter what. We don't get to choose what challenges we face, but we do get to decide how we face them, spirituality. The first thing we need to do is let go of the idea that life will ever be normal again. Beyond that, we need to stop living through social media and start connecting with the people around us, since those are the people we'll need to depend on when disaster strikes. And disaster will strike, you can be sure of that, so we must begin preparing today for the next shock to the social order, and the next, and the next. None of this will matter, though, if our preparations don't include imagining a new way of life beyond this one, after the end of fossil-fueled capitalism. Not a new normal, but a new ethos adapted to the chaotic world we've created. Imagining a new way of life beyond this one, that's the Christian life, that's discipleship. That's what God offers us. We don't just need to heal our bodies, we need healing from the sickness that creates sickness. Healing from the distorted spirituality that got us here. We need an exorcism, in a sense, of anything that tears us apart and leaves us disconnected and turning on each other. We can't do it on our own, that's a fundamental truth, but we don't have to. Because God has triumphed and consumed and outloved every one of those destructive powers and emerged to walk alongside us. And so what Jesus offers is the chance to follow him into something better. And now, thinking of this great physician, let's sing.